Thanks so much for joining us. And today we're really here about to talk about understanding the 202s of security in online communities. And we'll get into it's it's a big mouthful and can mean a lot. So we'll get into really what that is in a few minutes here. And who we have here today, we obviously have myself, John Summers, Senior Community Manager here at Graziti Interactive. And we had Darren Goff, Founder and Managing Director of Island 23. So before we get started, I skipped a slide about what Graziti Interactive. Sorry about that, guys. So a little bit about Graziti. If you haven't known, if you're new to the webinar, I know we get a lot of people that come back, listen to us on a regular basis. We keep putting these out every monthly. Usually we have a webinar and supplement in some podcasts as well. But Graziti Interactive is a digital innovation leader, powering all businesses and dynamic marketing, digital marketing, enriching customer interactions, engaging in online communities, and data-driven citizen support. What that really means is we back up a lot of companies in terms of needing support, helping them out with their deployments, with their integrations, with their migrations, with their setups. And I specifically deal around communities. So we're day in, day out, we're helping customers and clients deploy communities, get the most out of communities, select platforms, and come up with how we can get the most out of it. And that's where we work with partners such as Darren here to help also determine strategy and best practices and really guide our customers by bringing them some of the best consultants and experts in the field. So we're really happy to have Darren here. And I would really give him a second to really talk about his company, Island 23, and what they do, and a little bit about himself, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, John. Really appreciate you having me on today. Yeah, it's great to be partnering with Graziti. Alok and I go back quite a long way. Which also is a nice segue into how far I go back in community. So I've been in and around community management for at least 15 years, probably nearer 20 now. So I started with a company in the UK called Money Saving Expert, which doesn't always mean a huge amount to people outside the UK. But in the UK, we grew it from a standing start to about 2 million people, with about 11 million people on the email letter. Just for context, that's about a sixth of the UK. So it became a really big deal. It was sort of at a time where community management wasn't necessarily as understood as it is now as a profession. So there's definitely some learning that I did along the way, a lot of mistakes made. I subsequently went to work with Richard Millington at Feverbee, who some people on the call might know or recognise the name as well. I sort of stood on the other side of the fence. So rather than be a community manager, we were building strategy, finding community managers, training, building platforms, all that great stuff. And then 4 years ago, I decided to go out and start Island 23. And really what Island 23 is, it is a consultancy, and we do a lot of online community management consultancy work. But what we also specialise in is the sort of safety tech aspect of communities. So we do a lot of work with organisations like the National Health Service in the UK to support mental health, wellbeing and care of moderators and community managers. And we're also a member of the UK Safety Tech Network, which is a UK government department run organisation, which really brings together some of, firstly, the biggest thinkers around people that build communities and run communities, but also those that build the technologies, and try and bring those closer together so that the technology is actually complementary and useful for the people that are kind of on the front end. And then obviously going forward in the future, how we innovate around that technology. And, online safety and security, I think, is probably the byword of the last couple of years. So I'm sure we'll come on to some of these things, but the sort of balance between anonymity and accountability and some of the things that we do to protect our users is kind of forefront of what we do as an organisation and what I'm very passionate about. So I hope that gives everyone just a bit of context about who we are. You'll excuse my British accent, but it complements nicely with John's American accent. And I hope we have a lot of fun on the session as well. And please do feel free to ask questions, as John says.
Yeah, thanks so much. And let me see. Oh, no, it's gonna not let me. Okay, so really getting into it about what does security or safety in the community mean? And to me, it can mean a bunch of things, right? It can really talk about your physical security and how you make sure your platforms are secure, all the way down to providing what we refer as a safe and secure environment that will foster engagement. One of the key things I think that really comes around community to get engagement and get people to trust you is do they even basically trust your website, right? And coming into it, and are you adhering to kind of like the basic social norms you would now of community, right? Are you, using screen names and these are things that we've evolved over the time, right? I think laws have changed over the years, so that's why this is a more of a what we call a 202, because we're really going to be going in a little bit more deeper in terms of how we can talk about data security, for instance, right? And one of the first things that really comes to mind is making sure when you're choosing a platform, right? If we really talked at the basic level of when you're trying to choose your platform, does it meet those requirements, right? And that leads to the question of social networks versus online communities. And I wanted to kind of get your kind of thoughts around security and people using social networks for their community and transitioning more over to online or their own branded communities and in context of security and safety.
Yeah, it's a brilliant kickoff question, John, actually. And it's the core thing, I think, around communities at the moment is this disparity between, owned communities. So, people like Facebook maybe that dictate the rules of the game, or any of the other social media type platforms. And the great thing about those are, they're essentially free for the most part, unless you want to spend a little bit on advertising or something. The barrier to entry is obviously incredibly low. You get your users on there really quickly. You can kind of go where the users are, so you can reach them, pretty easily and bring them together. And, for the most part, especially for an aspiring community, it always seems, I think, like it's really easy to do and to get started. And usually you can foster great engagement, when you've got a sort of smaller group of people. And typically people, I think at that point, unless the topic is very divisive, kind of interested to get in, they're maybe a little bit more open with their, security and the things they say on the community, because it feels kind of small and personal. But obviously behind that is the corporate machine of, and I use Facebook as an example, but I'm not picking on them. It's kind of any, social platform. But obviously they are storing your data. They're dictating the rules of the game. They're telling you how you can and can't run your community environment. And ultimately, I know Cambridge Analytica is sort of top of mind for a lot of people from a few years back, but all these platforms are still, in whatever form, are still using data. No matter what legislations they go through, no matter what type of lawsuits they go through, they are still using your data in a certain way, because that's how they run their organizations. And then we obviously have, as John said, the other type of community, which is the community that exists on what we'd call an independent platform. So it can be, something like a SaaS, so software as a service type of platform, something you self-host. So obviously the barriers are completely different with that. Getting started it can be a lot harder because there's a lot more things to do. It is more open, so you get to dictate the rules of the game, the way you construct the community, and also you have a say in a bit more in terms of what data you collect around people. So, are you going to use their social media to sign on? It could be a generic email. Is that okay? Are you going to take their email and hide their usernames? Are you going to allow them to use it? So you get all these options, but also you get all these problems because, especially the type of community you run, it might be that for some people, they're happy to share that, for some they're not. But ultimately, you get to control the rules of the game with that, and you're in charge of, how the data is processed. Now, there's sort of a midway point between that with some of the SaaS providers in that they may spin the platform up on their server, so the data is still held sort of independently, sort of midway between that and something like Facebook. But a lot of people typically will have an open source solution which they take on in-house and build around their own server as well. So sort of think about those as the sort of three areas really of completely held data. There's sort of like stepping stone of, a data is held on a server, they're not really doing a huge amount with it other than hopefully protecting it. And then the self-build type of community where you get to dictate the rules of the game, but obviously you have to make sure that the server is secure. And then there's a piece that sits over the top of this really, which is the sort of standard piece. So when we talk about things like ISOs, which are the sort of standards around how we run certain things, so a lot of platforms will sign up to, there's a certain ISO that takes you to sort of 97% of what is data secure, but there's a new one that a lot of organizations are looking at now, which is 27001. Really, I know, really exciting to drop numbers on you all. But then there's more thinking around how that is more adaptable to the world we live in now, because laws change between countries. How one country processes data is very different to how another does. And our communities run 24/7 and they run universally, right? So depending on where people are accessing from, it does mean sometimes the data is manipulated and stored in a very different way. And what the ISO standards and some of the policies they're trying to bring out now are attempting to do is sort of standardize how we protect data in most of those environments. But of course, every territory will have its different view on what it does with data and what the governments decide to allow. So just even off the bat, I think you can see there are a lot of challenges we face here around this. And, the world's growing at an exponential rate. The generation behind, 2 generations behind me, I've got a 7-year-old daughter. She's now accessing data at a much earlier age. It's just the environment they're used to. So we've got a generation now that are coming up behind us that, from the get-go are going to be starting to access data. They're excited to go on and get involved in these online worlds, but also they have no real understanding of what data is, what's happening with it. So I think there's a piece there to think about, not just, us as, I'll use the term loosely, but adults and how we're thinking about data, but also the legacy piece of what we leave for the community, the people behind us and how they're going to use communities. So yeah, I'll stop there for a second, John, but a lot to think about, I think, as a kickoff in terms of what these platforms do and the options we have.
Yeah, no, you're right on. Like the platforms have evolved so much, and now if you're talking into a context of software and software delivering too, and you're putting that on your site and through your community, it changes your security standards and what you should be adhering to. So I guess one of the first tips is, if you're building your own community, check out the security requirements. They should have a bunch of these standard ISO and SOC levels of security to really conform to your security company. But moving past, so in an ideal world, we have this platform. Like you said, there's 3 different variants: external, this kind of middleware, and this one behind the firewall, if you would. And we see a lot of people, still wanting to put a lot of their internal content, if they can, do on-prem, or at least doing in a separate cloud or behind VPN and trying to secure it that way. Because the predominant platforms, the community platforms out there, are cloud-based, right? Almost most of the players today, your options for on-prem, unless you build it your own, right? If you go your own and do a Drupal route or something, but most of the options these days are going to be a cloud-based. And so, but once you get past that, I think it really starts coming down to creating this safe space so people know what they're saying is about creating, enforcing, community guidelines, right? I think this is a critical part in getting a community started and having those guidelines. So I wanted to get your thoughts about, what should people be setting up and enforcing these guidelines, and any tips you could trick around about really getting started.
Well, I'll start off with a funny story on that. Well, I find it funny anyway. So community guidelines are actually quite difficult to do as a one-size-fits-all approach. And we'll come on to that in a minute. So many years ago, we tried to bring some large organisations in the UK together, including newspapers and my community that I was working with at the time, and some media outlets and various other people. And we sat everyone down in a big room. We talked about how we would build our community guidelines. And we would kind of go around the room, and different people would have a different view on what they should be. And one of the parties in the room is quite a well-known site in the UK called Mumsnet, which I think is probably known globally in various parts as well. So it's a fantastic community, initially for mums, I guess, but fundamentally for parents, of people that go on and share, their frustrations, I think, fundamentally with, the kids' development phases and all the other stuff that goes with being a parent. And we sort of going around the room, we're talking about, so what do we think about swearing? And we're like, The Guardian, nope. Definitely not, it's not appropriate in a community. Various other people get to Mumsnet, and they were literally like, hell yeah. Yeah, we love a bit of swearing because it's catharsis for our members. And we were like, really? But it just proves the point that when you're thinking about your community guidelines, there's no one size fits all approach. But I think what's really important is to understand what the purpose of your community is for your members. So when you're building these guidelines out, make sure that the guidelines are not just done as sort of these generic, it should be a given that any illegal content, there are a few things I think we can all agree on we should never see in our communities. But I think being mindful of the type of audience you want to bring in and allow them to foster conversation in your community is really important. And just sort of thinking around what are the guidelines that are going to help our community. And I think guidelines are always perceived sometimes as negative, like a list of you can't do these things. But I think also it's really important to think about, and it's something we teach with clients, is to think about guidelines as pointers. Think about the word guideline. That quite often gets confused with critical guidelines, but I think actually they're a behavioural signifier as well. So it teaches the community, people that enter your community, about the types of things that they might want to talk about. We can think about the types of things we want to say to each other, how we respond to each other, how we maybe share information. Now, I think a lot of communities I see just focus on that first list. It's a list of, it's that kind of sign at the swimming pool that says, don't do all these things. But I think our community guidelines done in a good way are an opportunity to give people a sense of what is possible in a community. And then the final piece of that as well is think about the tone of voice that we're trying to create here. So much of communities is done on the nuance of how we use language, how we consistently apply that language to our communities, how we build slang terms. Quite often communities will end up developing a whole system of speech that is specific to their community. Yeah. So we're just encouraging that tone of voice from the start. How do you want your moderation team to sound? How do you want your community managers to sound? That how you set that community piece up in the guidelines will reflect how the members conduct themselves in the community as well. If you want a pretty laid back, SoCal approach of, hey dude, everything's awesome, that's the message you're giving to people when they walk into your community and reading these guidelines. If you want them to be a little bit more structured, use that as an opportunity to really impart what you want the community to be. So few communities take enough time to set these guidelines up properly, to think about the behaviors they want to encourage as well as the behaviors they want to stop. And quite often they'll get too far down the road and the community is sort of like starting to expand into life like a tree, and that's fantastic. But also behaviours will start to occur that they aren't expecting and they're not very comfortable with, and that's when it's very hard to unpick, because users will point to the guideline and say, we didn't ask me to do this, or you didn't, it wasn't in there. So that's the first thing you see right in a community. So just make sure that when you think about that, you're just thinking of behavioural positives as well as some of the things that you want to rule out.
Yeah, I always used to try to split my guidelines, and I would do guidelines and I would do ethics, right? So I would say here's like the ethics of the site. Here's like what we were expected behavior, and I would do like a community ethics and a community code of conduct, right? And kind of split them into multiple things. But after that, I think once these rules are saying, you touched on that, and it led me right into my next point that. Once you establish these rules, and you should do it early on before you're going, this would be one of your first steps, is establishing these documentation, right? So you can train and actually be an active community manager and an active moderator, because active community management and moderation is going to enforce these, right? You got to be in there, like you said, teaching people, learning, right? It's learned behavior. What are the accepted ways of communicating, behaving? So it might be moderation of removing or warning people if you're in that consumer-based community where you're a little more leeway about behavior, versus you might be in a tech B2B community where there's no leeway at all. It's a one strike and you're out type of environment. So really having, what are your thoughts on active community management and really how can that help in providing that safe environment and that secure community?
My thoughts are wide and extensive on that, but to drill down to what I think we're looking at is, I think it's also important to have the system of moderation in place from the start as well, because the term of ban hammer gets pulled out quite a lot about at what point do we remove members from our community, very extreme examples. And there's a couple of schools of thought on this. I think some people are always very loath to want to do it because it's always seen as, it's pretty terminal, and it doesn't feel nice to have to ban someone from your community. But I think along with community guidelines and maybe ethics as well, I think making sure your moderation policy is in place around what members can expect, when certain rules are broken. So whether that's, to use an analogy like a football card system, yellow card, red card, that type of thing, or whether it's a points infraction system. But that does two things as well. I think firstly, it teaches the behavior of what is and isn't acceptable. But I think also in terms of security, I think it's good for the general community to know that the moderation team does have a policy, does act on the policy, and actually, exposure to harmful content that other members, may put up. There is a process there to deal with it. So what you're trying to do with your members is build trust in the moderation team that, they're actually going to act in your best interest, and they're going to be fair, and they're going to, by having a process, they should, be applying the same steps in the same way. So users feel comforted that there's a process there as well. But, ultimately, we should never feel afraid to remove people from our communities. I think the misconception with communities is the same people in your communities on day one are the same people in your communities on year 3 or something. A certain core of them will be, typically those are the people that come on and they're like ambassadors or super users. And, you see some people that have just got these ridiculously high post counts. They're incredible members and they give their time so openly. But communities should change over time, right? Some people will drift away. It's human nature. Some people might lose interest in the topic, or, life happens to them. And, new people will come in, and that will change the demographic of the people moving your community. So again, just making sure that we're consistent in how we apply those moderation policies, I think just builds trust that the community is being proactively moderated in the right way. And I think if you don't have that piece in, along with your guidelines, the expectation setting, and how you ethically want to deal with your community, I think as a moderation team, it becomes much harder to control the community, but also to provide trust, to show that you are diligent and, accountable to the community as well in terms of what you're doing.
Yeah, you've definitely seen the repercussions of that, even in, say, Facebook and the news, right? When they're removing people from their system, they had this documented, so they had the backing of it, right? I unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which way it is, worked at a community where we was also a video game, and we were banning like 150 people a day. So I kind of got used to the language of what to say. And, you got a temporary ban, you're banned for the day, you're banned for the hour, because it was like stupid comments and swearing and things like that. We weren't going to they're playing the game, right? We don't want to alienate and lose our customers by pissing them off. So we're trying to give them as many chances as we can. Is really, and I think it's really going to be dependent on your community and what's socially acceptable. If you look at, other communities that are out, like 4chan, where pretty much anything is acceptable. And it's very hard to get banned.
Sure.
It's really going to be dependent on your audience, your business, and your business practices. But that really comes into the challenges of, moderating user-generated content, right? And I want to say, any tips that you can give around moderation of this user-generated content you get out there, especially maybe when there's a lot of it. How do you get through it, right? And are you using tools out there, or is it just really being hyper vigilant and doing what you can?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both those things. I think technology is advancing at an incredible pace. When I started, it was an incredibly manual process, to the point where a spam filter and maybe IP banning was basically the tools in your armory. And, in those times, that led to some very, humorous instances. There's a town in the UK called Scunthorpe. So if you take the sort of second to the fifth letter of that, and that word was in our spam filter, so poor people from Scunthorpe could never type their town in because it would just basically block it out. So those kind of very broad stroke approaches. Whereas now technology, the advent of, I think, machine learning and AI in terms of how it's understanding sentiment in our communities, is definitely is a positive thing. And every platform will have its own version of this. It'll implement technology in a very different way. So again, I think it's important to understand, as a moderation team or as a community team, what is it you want to get out of the community and where are your lines drawn? I think it leads me on to the other part of that, though, is just the advent of AI, I think, is seen slightly as the kind of catch-all for everything. AI and machine learning will basically solve all of humanity's problems, which I think is a very dangerous path to go down. And we see a lot of examples all the time of where AI gets a lot of communities into trouble. And I think, ultimately, when we're talking about, you mentioned Facebook earlier, I mean, there was a great Verge article from a couple of years ago talking about the trauma floor at Facebook, and all these moderators were just exposed to all this incredibly harmful content around suicide and self-harm and graphic gore videos and this kind of stuff. And this was like a daily click process for them, harmful video, yes, no, click it away. And you think about these people on probably a fairly average wage, but that's not really the point, just being constantly exposed to this type of stuff. And I think we have to be really careful and vigilant about how we're using people in the process. That case has actually just been, I think it's been approved by a judge to settle for, I think about, I can't remember how many people, 10,000 people, I think, brought a class action suit against them, or the company that was providing those services. And they're in line, I think the payout was about 85 million for post-traumatic stress disorder, which sounds amazing, but actually when you break it down, it only works out to be $8,500 per person. If you worked out against an hourly rate, right? So how many, I don't know, 15, 20 bucks, how many dollars is that to be exposed to harmful content when you could have a much quieter life somewhere else? So I think we need to be thinking constantly and vigilantly about how technology is used and how people are used as well, and how we protect the end people that are actually running our communities. And I think part of this discussion is also people build technology. They don't always think about the people that have to use the technology and how those people need to be human. You know, it's okay that we use the robots. We kind of have to keep the humans involved as well. In my head, I always have that picture from Futurama of like Bender and Fry, you know, coming together just as this sort of like perfect storm of things. But, you know, it's I think it's really dangerous to assume one and not the other. And, you know, a lot of it is a manual. We do still need people in the mix, I think, to make sure that the machine understands the context of some of this stuff. But, you know, certainly moderation's moved on a long way in the certainly in the time that I've been doing it, probably for you, John, as well.
Yeah, no, and even today, spam removal and link spam on communities is still real. It's for many years they will attack your site, put links on there. If you have any community manager's been doing it for any bit of time, you will know what I'm talking about. And it's a pain in the butt to get those link spammers off your site. But that's where I think really what I want to talk in about, you know, rewarding positive behaviors and, you know, coming up with what might be counterintuitive as increase permissions, ability to do more over time, right? Actually limiting your community members' ability to post or post pictures or to interact with the site and actually have to gain that right? So I think that's a more common tactic you're seeing now with gamification and point systems and community, where you're able to throttle how many posts they make per day. And as you gain more points, get more, you know, you can actually post it all the time, right? Instead of only posting once a day, right? Because we didn't know if you're a spammer or not. So what are your thoughts on rewarding behaviors and increase access over time based off good behavior?
Yeah, I mean, gamification is I find gamification quite a challenging one in community, because I see some very good and some very bad deployments of it. I think the problem with rewarding good behavior with increased access is that quite a lot of the time, the window to convert someone that's registered for your community into someone that wants to stick with your community is pretty short. Like, it's less than a day, it's probably hours, you know. So I think if that process isn't set up in a way that makes people feel like they actually are making progress, I think there's you know, if you think about how short people are on time in general, and they might want to do that one thing right in community that you're telling them they have to spend 3 months in the community and post 100 times or something to do. So that person, again, depending on what your community context is, you know, that person might go away and never come back again. But I think there's some other things we can do around, you know, for me, it's always around what's that magic sauce that happens beyond what everyone does in the community. So when we work with brand communities, you know, companies that develop products or services or do things like that, for me, it's like the reward and the gamification comes, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz. It's like seeing behind the, you know, the curtain. It's like having access to things that the general population don't have access to. So for example, we've set up, you know, elevated groups where people have you know, certain permission levels and they have their own kind of community space, you know, giving them access to maybe products that are coming up or services and inviting them to focus groups or feedback, you know, those sort of things that make them feel like, because of their behavior has been so positive in the community, because they're such a renowned member, that they're able to access things that just add value to the company. I think also think about your communities. What's valuable to you? Is giving someone a badge for 100 posts after 3 months, is it actually valuable? You know, it's a mechanism they have to go to. But what is the end result for you? You get a member that's slightly happier. It may be, you know, it may be absolutely the right thing for you to do, but I think in terms slightly more in what the benefit is to your community in general. Is it access to a group where you're going to lead a session, you know, and ask me anything, and you're bringing someone in from a community space, much like this, or someone better than me, or, you know, someone in the industry or in a sector or even a hobbyist community. You know, the Olympics have just been going on. I see great examples of people that, you know, bring in certain characters that want to give their time, people that associate with these industries, and they run like, you know, closed AMA sessions. Wow, you know, for a community member that's being rewarded for good behavior, imagine this, you know, imagine going and speaking to these people in sort of like a VIP ticket private room. So there's a whole bunch of things I think we can do for community members. I think just be a little cautious around penalizing people who maybe don't have the time or inclination to want to hit what are probably fairly arbitrary milestones just to continue to be an improving member of the community. What we want to do is we want to find the people really early on that are active and really positive and doing great things in our community. We want to get them up to speed as quickly as possible, because we don't want them to have to take ages, right, to go and do all these great things that are going to benefit our community. So I think it is important. I think context is really important in terms of what you want to achieve with it.
Yeah, that lowering that barrier to entry is real, right? I've working with a customer recently, just on the sign-in process, right? Trying to make it as simple as possible to get in and to ask that question. And if you make it too difficult to even register, you'll lose a lot of your registration in those questions just from, you'll see they'll go to the registration page and you'll see, drop off after the registration page. They don't complete because it's too long, or there's too many steps, or they don't want to give you this information. So I guess that's where maybe like social logins is a good way to do. Social logins give your site credibility of trust by having, say, okay, let me log in with Google or log in with Facebook or log in with whatever it may be, versus using, a unique identifier that you got to create your new account. Personally, I like it. I think it does give me a credibility, because I know that when information, if I sign in, Google is passing, is going to be looked after. And versus if I'm not using a social authentication kind of a login, then it's questionable on what they're going to track, or is it? What are your thoughts about social login as a safety mechanism?
Yeah, I think social login it's just sheer convenience for me. Like, most people are at that point, if they've got a social account, they tend to be logged into it anyway. So the process is incredibly easy, and it removes friction and a barrier to entry. I think in terms of safety and security, I think the difference is that people are still creating content on your community and not on Facebook or the social network. So I think there'll be a certain amount of information that's obviously held, and you have to decide, how comfortable you are on that. But then the trade-off for that is convenience. So, how do we get people onto our site? But the difference is, when you're on a Facebook group or whoever else it is, the content's being created on the group, and Facebook can, pretty much see that, no matter what they claim they do. And they're, it's a way for them to, even if they generalize, it's still a way for them to understand what's going on in their communities. The difference is, when people come through, is that also you're creating that content on your community. So, you again get to set the rules of the game. You get to control the way you moderate. You get to control the way the person feels in the environment, and you get to control the type of content that's created. And, to a point, you own that. That's yours to sort of, do what you will with. So I think social, logon can definitely be, an interesting one. I think the danger always comes with social logon is when you get into communities, especially or people that don't want to feel like they can't be anonymous. So I do a lot of work in the mental health space, for example. We work with lots of charity organizations, people like Alzheimer's and various others. And the worry that their users always have is that they might want to share a story, and they can't tell at that point, unless the community's been very clear and specific, what information is going to be seen when they post in the community. So it might be a very sensitive subject that they find a community, and it's maybe they've maybe gone to their keyboard 10 times and then, oh God, I'm not sure about this. And it's an email address. A lot of the time they might start with an anonymous email, just one they've created, and they spin it up, and there's nothing to track on there. And they might use a random username. They might still do that with social, but I think there's always a worry in terms of social is, what are they actually doing with that little token in the background? So I think, again, the way that process works, think about the messaging, think about being really upfront and honest about what you've turned on and off, and what's collated and what's created, because I think that's the thing that I think is always a worry for people. And then again, the trade-off with convenience. But ultimately, you are getting them through a process quicker, and you're getting them into a place where you want them to be, and you get to dictate the rules of the game. So there is that.
Yeah, and I always found also the context of who your audience, that B2B kind of audience, and like getting a Facebook login. I would never put that on any of my previous communities, just because the personal email is going to come through, or their personal contact information. I think seeing like LinkedIn having their login now, I think is a really great option if you're in that B2B environment, or into that secure type, of a little more security or data security. I think it's a great option out there for people. But ultimately, we want people to feel that they've logged in, they felt safe. And what are your thoughts about creating these more, like you said, people want to join these groups, they're smaller, but creating informal spaces that so people can socialize, interact, versus main like product areas that will increase and build trust of your community and feel like a safe place? And what are your thoughts maybe about these kind of off-topic areas for increasing trust?
Divisive. So just go back to your point on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn has actually a little more trust associated with it. I tend to find when I work with people than I think the Facebook, Twitter, et al., Instagram, whatever, I think they're seen slightly differently. I think LinkedIn sits slightly further forward in the trust issue because, you know, it is fundamentally a business network. And I think the way it deals with data is slightly different. So I think that is actually a good option for a lot of communities, but obviously it probably limits the field a little because I guess many more people have those other social platforms than they do LinkedIn, you know, generally, I think in terms of, off-topic spaces, I think that the one thing I'd like to see removed from communities is this like this hello thread, which I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago was kind of a great idea when we didn't have great tech and we were kind of just trying to find a way to do it. But no one really ever comes to a community. You don't walk into a restaurant or a bar or something and just walk up with a group of people around a table and just start talking about yourself. It just doesn't happen. Some people might do that, but I think generally that mechanism, it doesn't really work. So I think about the reasons that people have come to your community. So generally it's because they've got an issue to solve, like especially when it's a product or a service. They're usually there because no one comes to broadband routers or us because they just are so passionate about the router and they've got a framed picture and it's all like, no one does that, right? They're usually coming there because they either want to know a bit more about the products, they've got a question, or they've bought the product and they've got a problem. So those are the two reasons. So no one at that point is going to spend time writing a whole spiel about themselves because it's really not what they're interested in. That's a very different mechanism. But I think the sort of non-branded, so the kind of hobbyist, fun interest communities, I think there's a bit more of a middle ground there of people that are kind of coming because they have an interest in mountain bikes or yoga or something, and they want to come. They found this community, they want to sort of interact. But again, I think very few people will just come straight into an open space and just start talking about themselves. I just don't think that really happens generally in communities. So I think it's really important to think about where people do drop and land in your community. And we've got some great ways to look at data now from how they've come in from Google or wherever, the types of things they've searched for. And don't do this thing where you just drop them into somewhere generic and you just sort of like, help yourself, and no one ever does. They're sort of a bit overwhelmed and they might click around. I think actually connecting how they've come in with the thing they want to see and getting them into a conversation or into a piece of content that's actually relevant to them, I think has a much better, in my experience, a take up of people that are going to then go on to engage. And, those sort of off-topic areas, I call them like the virtual pubs of this world, they do definitely serve a purpose. We had a huge one at Money Saving Expert that actually got so big in the end, it became really difficult to moderate because it's a bit of a Wild West. People saw it as the chance to have a bit of a free-for-all.
It's your moderation area, right? It's your moderation nightmare area. It's where people are always going to post something wrong.
Exactly, yeah. And so they do serve a purpose, and the purpose it actually served for us was keeping the crap off the other threads, right? It was keeping people that want to talk about the weather or moan about politics or whatever else it might be. It was sort of keeping them in an area they were pretty happy with, and usually there's like a core of members that are the most vocal in your community, and they tend to exist in those areas. They kind of, I think they're drawn to each other, but a lot of them are perfectly fine. But then it sort of kept people that wanted to learn about a very specific part of, in this case, finance. And, conversation still goes off topic. I think that's really important. But I think just sort of remove, maybe from, if people sort of take away one thing, I think just remove that generic, come one, come all approach, because I think a lot of the time it's just for a moderation team, it's just more effort than it's worth, spending time trying to get these people. I don't think humans tend to work like that. You have to build trust first, and then they might come back into discussion areas. But yeah, again, to use that analogy, I don't know if you have, John, I've never been to a social event where we've all stood around a King Arthur's table and we've just gone round one by one and people have just, spoken for 10 minutes about their historical background. It's very unlikely to happen. So I think maybe just changing the way we approach those things is probably better than, having them as the first point of contact.
So I guess we got some questions, but just to conclude that, I think a safe community is a happy community. I like that saying, right? So I think if you provide these kind of like these safe environments, people are happy and they're engaged. So we do have some questions, and I want to make sure we have time to go through them here. So let's look at some of these questions here. Todd has one of the first ones that came in. It says, has anyone been locked out of the community by hacking or hit with a denial of service attack? This is something that I was looking into to an article about the other day, especially related to ransomware, right? So I was asking other community managers, what would you do if you got hit with like ransomware? I have seen it. I have been denial serviced on my community, and I've also been post flooded. I don't know how to explain it, but there was a group of people posting the same graphic picture over and over on the community, and if I banned that account, they had another one. They kept going in succession. They flooded my board. And then I did have a denial of service a long time ago, but this is like using vBulletin 15 years ago. I think it's a little more difficult now than to do that, but I don't know. Have you heard of someone getting denial of service or, actually attacked like that?
Yes, we did at Money Saving Expert on the vBulletin platform. So when we started to get quite big, we got quite a big DDoS attack, and we were
vBulletin.
Yeah, right. And you'll know the back end of vBulletin. It's like as soon as you start to need to do anything with it, but God bless them, that software is really old now. I think it tended to Zen 4.0 or something, but we got DDoS. But unfortunately for companies that get into that sort of progress stage, usually your infrastructure, your sort of security teams are still fairly immature in general, not because the people aren't great, which they are, but that you're not generally coached to take on that attack. So we kind of had to shut everything down for a while, which is pretty costly because a lot of the funding for the community and the way the website was supported was done with things like referral links and stuff. So it was a revenue hit for us, even though we weren't served with ransomware. But one thing to think about actually is just to have one organization I work with, which are quite a large, well-known brand. Something happened to them recently where I think people might have seen the story a couple of weeks ago. Quite a few large places sort of went down briefly, and there was a panic that like some banks went down and various other places. There was a bit of a panic that it might have been a ransomware attack, but the process kicked in the same way or DDoS attack rather. The process kicked in the same way because it's still your platform's gone dead. But actually, what we realised was because the community and the platform were hosted in two slightly different places, we could actually get messaging out on one, like if one goes down. So I think maybe to think about having some sort of backup you can spin up sometimes as well. But I think it's generally these days, I don't know these stats, but I think it's probably more unlikely for smaller communities to get this type of, I think software is fairly secure. Certainly the name software that we use these days is generally pretty secure. I mean, you can, as with anything cyber, you can never say never. I think the piece that's always missing for me, and this is something that I've seen recently, is just the fact that cybercrime, I don't think, and the sort of the police, or federal law, whatever you want to call it, I still don't think they're robust enough to support online communities and platforms. So during the Euro tournament, which was a big event in Europe here, which is a massive football tournament for anyone that don't know, England got through to the final. Yay, amazing. We lost on penalties. Boo. We're all apparently adults here. But unfortunately, 3 of our black players got, abused on social media. And it was a pretty horrific thing that happened. Various platforms. Instagram was, I think, the worst of it. But actually, what we kind of realised is that cybercrime is they're just not set up to deal with it. It's like after this happens, they made 5 arrests, right? 5 arrests. I know people personally that have posted 10 examples of where this racist abuse was happening. And I think just the support that comes from, we can talk about how platforms need to be better, and they definitely do. But I think at the moment there's a real gap in terms of how the law supports online spaces, because I think there's only so much we can do as community platforms, and we do need to do more, and the big ones definitely need to do more to protect this. But I think a lot of the time we don't have that next step, right? You get DDoS, you get ransomware. I don't think it's always clear to know where to go to get support, how to deal with that beyond that. And I think that's the piece for me when it comes to technology that's actually missing at the moment, is that support from the sort of the governments and the organization powers that have that or should have that ability to help.
So it is here in the States, it is the government, because I worked on a product and we did get hacked and they stole our software and put it on a server. We had to deal with FBI and Interpol, but that's a whole nother story. But really we had to take down our site too when we got flooded with pictures. But the question is about how do you how can you build back trust then, right? If you got hacked or God forbid, but I don't think it would happen, but clear communication, I think, is how you rebuild that trust, right? And letting people know. I think any company out there dealing with security breaches in general, being honest, forthright, and letting people know what's happening is the only way, right? I think.
Yeah, honesty. That it's as simple as that. Being honest, and I think responding quickly where you can is always, like, if you've got any other channels, like if you use social media and you can push something out, or if you do have a blog or a main site and you can just push a piece of content out. I think frustration comes when people don't understand what's happening. That's generally where I find the most trust is lost, when the company doesn't seem to be dealing with it. But even when you come back up, if you can just explain, during our attack, we created an editorial piece, not particularly long, just saying what happened. Everyone understood that we were the victim. Everyone understood at that point that it wasn't through our doing, but we were apologetic and we were sorry. It's ruined the experience for everyone. And then we thought about a few fun things, way we could kind of reboot, like almost turned it into a bit of not a joke, but kind of like a cathartic experience, right? So we spun up a few sessions. I think we had a few like online games. We just did some sort of things to get people kind of motivated and back into the community. But most people are, generally speaking, I think they're just completely understanding about it. But deal with it quickly. And just be honest, just be completely honest about what happens to your community, and also just maybe just reassure people that you've putting things in place to ensure that it limits the chance of it happening again. I think those are the three things: response time, honesty, action, probably across to give people trust again.
It was a major thing, is being honest and forthright and quick too, responding and not holding it off, because if the longer you wait to respond, and that's one of them in the history, community, we were able to respond to a lot of people in a very short amount of time to kind of get the word out when there is any company issues or problems, and act as the community, to act as that mitigation tool, or get out there and let people know, hey, this is what's going on, and we're being honest about it. I think there's your audience, they like you already. They signed up. They like your product. They're in there using your community. They just want to know what's going on, I think, right? And that is the key. I learned that in my electronic arts days, when we had like some very big in terms of, we were collecting privacy with malware on video games and to try and stop to stop privacy or piracy. So it was to try to stop you from copying the CDs, right? And everybody found this little piece of malware, that was in there that would basically not let you copy the CD. And it was tracking who your computer was and all this stuff that wasn't acceptable back then. And it kind of slowly brewed. And then on the community, we were trying to remove the posts. And now it's like it was ignored for so long, where we had to create a section of it, and we're regular posting, and really had to bring in an Ask Me Anything with the legal team, so they got to that point where like we have Ask Me Anything with all the legal team in here,
I bet
and
they
really
love that.
they did. It was like one of the most popular topics, but the thread was like awesome.
Yeah.
And the guy that helped us out with it, he was up for it. He knew this was going to be a little difficult, but needed, because we were getting thousands of posts a day on it. This was a big company, and so it needed to be mitigated. So I think community can help a lot in that. So we got some of the other questions here. Oh, can you please give insight into regulatory process like GDPR and CCA in place? How do you strike a balance between data privacy and personalized experiences? That's a hard one, right?
Yeah, I think for me, that's a fantastic question. I think it's the biggest challenge we face right now is how we basically balance between the right of free speech and anonymity, and people not wanting to be able to discuss, and accountability. So that story I told about the Euros is kind of an example of that, because a lot of those accounts also are they're not particularly people's names. There's a lot of anonymous content that's posted as well, and we see this with Apple recently, right? So Apple have introduced this this coming update where it's called the CSAM, so the Child Sex Abuse Material Policy. And what it's going to do is sort of look at iCloud and on your device. I think it's a bit hazy exactly which one, if not both, it's going to look at. But it kind of matches it against a known database of like child abuse images, and will kind of flag what's on the devices. And Apple, who obviously position themselves as like security first, you are secure with us. Like there's a really big question there about, privacy. Now, most people obviously would say the fact they're trying to do something about child abuse is great, but I've seen quite a lot of backlash on that. And the thing that's got missed out of that story is there's still a person in that process. So they still have checkpoints where a human being still has to go in and validate what's happening on there. But that's a very extreme example. But I think in general, I find it always a little bit crazy that people will seem to give all their data online on Facebook for like a free bottle of Coke, like a voucher or something they can print out. And yet, on the other hand, in the same breath, they're kind of really angry about these things that the company do with their data. And I think that's the biggest challenge of us going forward is just, I want everyone to feel safe online. The UK has just brought out a law on, child abuse, online harms as well. But there's a big piece in that, people still want to have a personality. They want to be able to express themselves. And also, for us operating our platforms, if we don't hold any data about people, it becomes very hard to actually moderate. You mentioned the thing about, having to ban all the accounts. If everything's anonymous all the time, it's very difficult to actually be able to control, to have some sort of accountability for what's going on in the environment. And I can see the needle swinging back and forth all this time. And I hope that to the question, I hope that things like GDPR and CCPA and the ISO policies do come in sensitively to handle some of that stuff. But I think even things like implied, like the cookie thing now, like I just find it a massive annoyance on every website I go to. You have to imply consent and kick this thing away. Like I get the policy behind it. I just find it unbelievably irritating. It's only like 1 second of my life. So I think it's like the way these things are deployed in our communities. But again, it's working with the people that run these spaces to make sure that they're fit for purpose, not just what a team that was sat in a room that didn't see the end result think. It's the context and sensitivity I think is going to make the difference. But great question.
Yeah, it's my history is you just got to go to like the lowest denominator, right? Like look at what will get you in trouble in Europe, and go to that in US because it's different in terms of the data you collect, names, email, not sharing email, getting a username, not asking for their free. It's very it's difficult to navigate, and I really say consult with your legal team and get with them in terms of what they're adhering to and what they want to adhere to. Let me see. We had some other questions. Darren John, how can you deliver a humane experience to community members by using tech and big data in communities? Humane experience. So keeping the human interest when they're not using like AI and automation. I think that's where like the active community management moderation really comes in, right?
Absolutely. I was going to say that the very simple answer is don't underinvest in your community management team. The amount of companies we see that invest, substantial amounts of money in the technology, and sometimes without completely understanding it. And that's why I love Grizity in terms of the way you think about the journey between both those things. Like the implementation is really important of working with the people that use it. You've heard me say this probably 6-7 times now, and the technology itself. But your community management team is the thing that makes the difference. It's why you're not social media. It's just social media. It's why you're not all these other things. They're the people that take the tech, shape it, deploy it in the right way, and also are constantly listening to what people are really saying and engaging with them to understand where their pain points are, where it's not working for them, what they'd like to see, and actually iterate the technology in a way that works for you. You can't do that with Facebook, right? You play by Facebook's rules. So you have complaint on a Facebook group, unlucky. You can do some great community. I do see community managers doing some great stuff on Facebook, but ultimately it's still the same environment, right? It's just customized in a slightly different way. But do not invest in your community management team. If you're going to do this community thing, have the same budget, because you're quickly going to find you've got a very expensive empty space of people that are just going, well, there's some lovely features here, but I'm not really sure what to do. And the moderation system seems a bit clunky. I'm not sure if it's fair. I don't really understand. It's the humanity piece. That's the thing that makes it different for our communities.
No, I couldn't agree more. I always used to say like you never see like a good product with a bad product manager. So why do you expect to get a good community with no community manager, right? Like you need a good community manager to have a community the same way you need a good product manager to have a very successful product. And if you don't have someone who's knowledgeable and skilled, I really think you're going to struggle as an organization without, trying to bring on, a consultant. If you can't hire full time and do that, there's great people like Braziti and like Darren and people out there that can help you out. So we've got a couple of minutes left here. We got another
Wow,
question here.
Quick, John.
Yes, it has. We'll do this last question, then we'll kind of wrap it up. But any thoughts on how comfortable members will be with interacting with bots? So, as AI and community and automated responses, I built a tool last year where it actually will respond to a community post. Trying to work on that. So, what are your thoughts about interacting with helpful bots? If it's good.
Yeah, so just quickly, I want to touch on the question before that Caitlin raises. Caitlin, great point. Just very, very quickly, absolutely. Think about the data you need to collect for your community. As you hear me say several times, context is all important. And the sign-up process can be as complicated or as simple as you need to make it, but absolutely think about, are you collecting this data for a reason, or are you collecting it because that was the out-of-the-box thing they gave you and you just kind of stuck with it as well? So sorry to just interrupt you there, John, but Caitlin, thanks for that. It's such an important and good point. But in terms of things like bots and that, so I think bots is really, it depends on the type of community you're running. If you're running a product or service community and you're, I don't know, Verizon or someone, and the bot can basically answer the question because it works from a list of, sort of predefined
knowledge artists. Yeah, it's got a bunch of knowledge base articles, and you could have found it in search, but you didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And like sometimes the bots are getting quite clever now. So after the first question, like it can like direct you down a path, and you can sort of find the sort of nuance within the question. But I always find with bots, anytime they're applied to sort of a more kind of general community, sort of not specific around product, I always find it very obvious when you're talking to a bot in my experience. And I always find you get to a point quite quickly where it hasn't really answered my question, and I'm just sort of a little bit more frustrated with the process. But also, I understand that when you use it on a product or service, in terms of like cost deflection from your customer service team, it could be a massive one for that. The thing is with bots is to make sure you actually spend the time designing the flow, right, and the process properly. It's no good having like 3 questions and 3 answers, because that's going to cover about 0.5% of all your customers. So if you're going to do it, actually invest in the structure, build the tree properly. Ask your community, look for the type of questions they're talking about, the type of things they want to know. And also, when you fire the bot up, don't just leave it. Look at the data, look at what people are putting into it. Did it get the result? The up down checks. Were people happy with it? Were they getting the result? If you're going to invest in it, continue to invest in it, because if you don't, I think people are just going to get frustrated.
Okay, well, geez, yeah, bots. Man, I could go on for a little bit about bots, but at first, like the ones that are just the standalone bots, I was like kind of adamant against them on the community. I was like, why would you ask the bot? You should ask the community. If you don't ask the community, then no one knows. You don't get the tribal knowledge. I don't get SEO. I don't get search. It kind of defeats the purpose of the community. But there are a lot of these like transactional questions, like you said, in a lot of communities where they're really looking for something very specific that's already known. And having a bot that can interject directly into the discussion and cut that off can be a huge cost savings to an organization, right? From moderation, to community manager, to escalation to a support person, escalate to another, to level 2, and to find out that the question was already answered in the community in another post, right? That could be a huge waste of money, but it's a balance.
Is where it's changed. Yeah, customer service, I think, will continue to change. I think there's a stat by McKinsey or Gartner or one of those outfits that talks about it's something like 75 to 80% of any call center's questions are the same over and over, just phrased in different ways. And then there's only like a small percentage that are actually very niche particular. And I think those are the ones as a call center you want to focus on, because that's where the value's added, right? And if you can remove the stress of the other 80, 75%, whatever it is, and have it answered in the community, have peer-to-peer support and a bot, if all those things are blended in the right way, then I think you can get the result you want. But just, again, don't do anything in isolation, and don't underinvest in any of those things. If you're going to do it properly.
Yeah, no, really the setup is key, right? You look at your thresholds, how quick it responds, how fast it responds, look at the dialogue flow, make sure it's not asking the stupid questions, right? And annoying people, and make sure it's logging it. And when you do, if you do get handoff to like the customer support person, you're passing that log and that history along as well too. So that's something to think about when you're using like a chatbot, that you really want to show, okay, where the data from the chatbot, is it exportable? Can I get that over to my customer support data? Or can I bring the link from the community where it's inbound into that customer support ticket to really give that agent the most data possible before they talk to that customer? Because I know I hate it when I've gone through a live chat, or not even a live chat, it's just some chat thing. I've been talking to this guy, and then they pass me off to like the live person. They're like, "Tell me what your problem is." You're like, "Bro, I just spent 5 minutes chatting, with a bot, telling him what is my problem."
Yeah, speak to the bot. The bot knows.
Yeah, talk to the bot. That's a good one. But we're just about a time. We're at the top of the hour, and I just wanted to do super thanks for doing this. And if people want to reach out to you or find you, where's some good places if you want to get a little plug in right now?
If you want to chat about anything, it's just Darren, which is DARREN at Island23, so ISLAND 23.co.uk. But if you type that in, or me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always interested to meet people that are doing great work in the space, and even though there's no particular needs you have, if you're just interested in connecting and sort of picking up the conversation. And we work with some great people between me, John, and Graziti. Todd Nilsson's on the call, and Piper, thank you for your kind comment as well. And there's some great people around the industry. So this industry, make no mistake, the pandemic has amplified something that was already going in one direction. Community management is massive, and it's going to be huge in the next 10 to 15 years, especially. So yeah, that's maybe my closing message. But thank you for having me, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And if you want to check out me, you can find me on LinkedIn, John Summers, obviously. If not, go check out graziti.com and check out my community management as a service section. Really doing some cool things over there. And also a shout out looking in October timeframe. So we are going to be doing community refocused. So we're really excited to be doing another event this year. It's going to be in mid-October. Look for save the date coming out within the next couple of days here, hopefully. And we're going to have some great lineup of speakers. And as always, have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.